I should have seen it coming. That's what I tell myself now, years later, when I replay that moment in the fluorescent-lit common room of Morrison Hall. I should have recognized the shift in Felix's eyes, the way his usual manic energy suddenly went still and focused. But I didn't. I was too busy laughing at whatever ridiculous thing he'd just said, probably something about Professor Chen's habit of wearing the same cardigan 3 days in a row, or how the dining hall's mystery meat was clearly a government conspiracy. The laughter felt good that night. It always did with Felix. He had this way of making everything lighter, even during finals week when the air in our dorm felt thick with stress and the smell of energy drinks gone stale. The common room was full of our usual crowd. Maya sprawled across the worn couch with her anthropology textbooks. Derek and Sam hunched over a chess game that had been going on for 2 hours, a few others scattered around with laptops and highlighters. The kind of scene that had become familiar over our 3 years here, the kind I'd grown to depend on without realizing it. Felix was sitting beside me on the floor, our backs against the couch, close enough that I could smell his shampoo and the faint trace of cigarettes he thought he hid so well. He'd been on one of his tangents, gesturing wildly with his hands the way he always did when he got excited about something ridiculous. I remember thinking how his hair had gotten longer, how it fell across his forehead when he leaned forward, and how I had this fleeting urge to brush it back. But that was normal, wasn't it? The kind of idle thought you have about a friend without meaning anything by it. Then he went quiet, mid-sentence, mid-gesture, like someone had hit a pause button on his usual chaos. The change was so sudden it made me stop laughing, made me turn to look at him properly. His green eyes had this look in them I'd never seen before, something serious and almost nervous, which was impossible because Felix didn't do nervous. Felix did reckless. Felix did impulsive. Felix did whatever came into his head without thinking about consequences. He was staring at me with an intensity that made my chest feel tight, and I could feel the others starting to notice the shift too. Maya looked up from her textbook. Derek paused with his hand hovering over a chess piece. The room didn't go silent exactly, but there was this subtle change in energy, like everyone was holding their breath without knowing why. I should have pulled back. Should have made some joke to break the tension, deflected the way I always did when moments got too heavy. That was my role in our friendship, the steady one, the careful one, the one who kept things from spinning too far out of control. But something in Felix's expression held me frozen. He looked like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump. Then he leaned in, not fast, not playful, not with the exaggerated movements he usually made when he was performing for an audience. Slow, deliberate. His hand came up to cup the side of my face, fingers cool against my skin, and I felt my breath catch somewhere in my throat. Time seemed to stretch and compress all at once. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, could smell the mint gum he'd been chewing earlier, could see the way his eyelashes cast tiny shadows on his cheeks. I thought he was joking. I had to be joking. This was Felix, who once convinced half the freshman class that the campus squirrels were trained government spies, who regularly dared people to do increasingly absurd things just to see if they would, who treated everything like a game. So when his lips touched mine, I expected it to last maybe half a second before he pulled back with that wicked grin, and everyone would laugh, and the moment would dissolve into another one of his legendary stunts. But he didn't pull back. The kiss was soft and real and utterly sincere, nothing performative about it. His mouth was warm against mine, and I could taste the mint and something else, something that was just him. My mind went completely blank. Every rational thought scattered like leaves in a windstorm. I forgot we had an audience. I forgot we were supposed to be just friends. I forgot everything except the impossible fact that Felix was kissing me, and it didn't feel like a joke at all. The room erupted. Whistles and laughter and someone, I think it was Sam, shouting something about owing Maya $20. The noise crashed over us like a wave, and Felix finally pulled back, but slowly, like he was reluctant to break the connection. His hand lingered on my cheek for just a moment longer than necessary, thumb brushing across my cheekbone in a gesture so tender it made my chest ache. Everyone was laughing, assuming it was exactly what it looked like. Another one of Felix's outrageous pranks, perfectly timed for maximum audience impact. Maya was shaking her head with exaggerated disgust, muttering something about boys and their need for attention. Derek was grinning and making exaggerated kissing noises. The moment was dissolving into chaos and jokes and normalcy, exactly the way it should. But I couldn't laugh along. I couldn't pretend to be shocked or embarrassed or amused. I just sat there, staring at Felix, my heart slamming against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Because I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that whatever had just happened wasn't funny to me. Not even a little bit. Felix was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, something flickering in his eyes that might have been uncertainty or hope or fear. For just a moment, the mask slipped, and I saw something raw and vulnerable underneath all his usual bravado. And someone threw a pillow at us, and the spell broke. Felix's grin snapped back into place, and he was laughing and deflecting questions and playing his part perfectly. But I couldn't stop staring at his mouth, couldn't stop thinking about how right it had felt when he kissed me. How I'd wanted to kiss him back. How, somewhere deep in a part of myself, I'd been careful never to examine too closely. I've been wanting that for longer than I cared to admit. The realization hit me like a physical blow. 3 years of friendship, 3 years of carefully maintained boundaries, 3 years of telling myself that the warm feeling in my chest when Felix smiled was just normal affection, nothing more complicated than that. 3 years of looking the other way when he brought dates back to the room, of pretending it didn't bother me when he talked about girls he liked, of convincing myself that the strange hollowness I felt during those moments was just worry about our friendship changing. I've been lying to myself. For 3 years, I'd been lying to myself, and now Felix had just shattered every careful wall I'd built with one impossible, perfect kiss. The conversation moved on around us, but I felt separate from it, like I was watching everything through glass. Felix was back to his usual self, making jokes and deflecting attention, but I caught him glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking. Each time our eyes met, something electric shot through me, a recognition of something that had shifted permanently between us. I wanted to grab him, to pull him somewhere private where I could ask him what that meant, whether he felt what I'd felt, whether the joke was really a joke or something else entirely. But I was frozen by the magnitude of what had just changed, paralyzed by the possibility that I'd been wrong about everything I thought I knew about us, about him, about myself. So I sat there in that familiar room, full of familiar people, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath me and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The kiss lasted maybe 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds had just rewritten the entire story of my life. I've always been the careful one. Even as a kid, I was the friend who read the warnings on playground equipment, who counted the money twice before buying something, who double-checked that doors were locked before going to bed. My mother used to say I was born serious, like I came into the world already worried about everything that could go wrong. Felix was the opposite from the day I met him during orientation week freshman year. He was the one who convinced our entire floor to sneak into the construction site where they were building the new library just to see what it looked like at night. He was the one who started the tradition of ordering pizza at 3 in the morning during finals week, not because anyone was particularly hungry, but because he thought studying was more fun when it felt like a party. He was the one who dared me to take Professor Williams's notoriously impossible advanced literature course, the one I'd been avoiding for 2 years because I was terrified of failing. I took the class because Felix looked at me with those green eyes and said he believed I could handle it. That was how it always worked between us. He pushed, I resisted, then eventually gave in because something about his confidence in me made me want to be braver than I actually was. Our friendship had this rhythm to it, this careful balance we'd maintained without ever talking about it explicitly. I was the one who made sure Felix ate actual meals instead of living on energy drinks and whatever snacks people left in the common room. I was the one who reminded him about deadlines, who helped him organize his notes when his backpack became an archaeological dig site of crumpled papers and broken pens. I was the one who walked him back to his room when he'd had too much to drink at parties, who listened when he called at 2 in the morning because he'd had another fight with his father. Felix was the one who made me laugh until my sides hurt. He was the one who convinced me to go to parties I would never have attended otherwise, who introduced me to people I was too shy to approach on my own, who somehow made everything feel like an adventure instead of a chore. He was the one who noticed when I was retreating too far into my own head, who would show up at my door with coffee and terrible jokes until I remembered how to be social again. We'd been roommates sophomore year, sharing a tiny double in Fletcher Hall that barely had room for 2 beds and 2 desks. I learned that Felix talked in his sleep, that he kept a journal he thought no one knew about, that he had panic attacks sometimes late at night when he thought too much about the future. He learned that I needed at least an hour of complete silence before bed to decompress, that I organized my books by author and got genuinely distressed when someone put them back in the wrong place, that I had a tendency to skip meals when I was stressed. Living together had this intimacy that felt natural and terrifying at the same time. Felix would borrow my sweaters without asking and somehow make them look better on him than they ever did on me. I would find his philosophy notes mixed in with my English papers and spend 20 minutes trying to decipher his handwriting before giving up and leaving them on his pillow. We developed this shorthand communication, entire conversations conducted through glances across the room during particularly boring lectures. There were moments that should have been clues, times when the careful boundaries of our friendship felt thinner than they were supposed to be. The night Felix got food poisoning, and I spent 12 hours monitoring his fever, falling asleep in the chair beside his bed with my hand on his forehead. The morning I had the flu and woke up to find him reorganizing my entire desk, so everything I needed would be within arm's reach. The way he always seemed to know when I was having a bad day before I said anything, appearing with my favorite coffee and a gentle smile that made my chest feel warm and tight. I told myself it was just friendship, good friendship, the kind people wrote songs about, but nothing more complicated than that. When I caught myself staring at the way his hair fell across his face when he was concentrating, I convinced myself I was just appreciating his features the way you might admire painting. When I felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest during the few weeks he dated Sarah from his chemistry class, I told myself I was just worried about our friendship changing, nothing more selfish than that. I became an expert at deflection, at turning uncomfortable moments into jokes, at changing the subject when conversations drifted too close to feelings I didn't want to examine. When Felix asked me why I never seemed interested in dating anyone, I shrugged and said I was too busy with schoolwork. When he mentioned that I was the most important person in his life, I made some comment about being honored to rank above his PlayStation and pretended my heart wasn't racing. The thing about lying to yourself is that it requires constant vigilance. Every moment that felt too intimate had to be reframed. Every flutter of attraction had to be dismissed. Every dream that featured Felix in ways that went beyond friendship had to be forgotten before I was fully awake. It was exhausting, but it felt safer than the alternative. Safer than admitting that somewhere along the way, my careful, controlled feelings had grown into something I couldn't manage. But now, sitting in my dorm room at 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling while Felix's kiss replayed in my mind on an endless loop, I couldn't maintain the lie anymore. The careful walls I'd built were crumbling, and I was forced to confront the truth I'd been running from for 3 years. I was in love with my best friend. Had been in love with him probably since that first night he'd shown up at my door with terrible Chinese takeout and a grin that made the world seem brighter. And that kiss, that impossible, perfect kiss, had just shattered every reason I'd given myself for why that love had to stay buried. The realization settled in my chest like a weight, heavy and unavoidable. Tomorrow I would have to face Felix, would have to pretend nothing had changed while everything had changed. I would have to look him in the eye and act normal while my entire understanding of myself had been rewritten in 3 seconds of his mouth against mine. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but all I could think about was the way he'd looked at me right before he leaned in, like he was asking a question I hadn't known how to answer. The next morning arrived with the cruel normalcy of sunlight through my blinds and the sound of Felix's alarm going off across the hall. I'd barely slept, spending most of the night staring at shadows on the ceiling and replaying those 3 seconds until they felt more like a dream than something that had actually happened. But the ache in my chest was real enough, and the way my pulse quickened when I heard his door open told me that nothing about last night had been imaginary. I stayed in bed longer than usual, listening to the familiar sounds of Felix getting ready for his morning run. The thud of sneakers being pulled on, the rustle of workout clothes, the soft curse when he inevitably stubbed his toe on his desk chair. Normal sounds that should have been comforting, but instead felt like they were happening in a different universe. One where I hadn't spent the night confronting 3 years of carefully buried feelings. When I finally emerged from my room, Felix was in the common room, doing his post-run stretches, still slightly breathless and damp with sweat. He looked up when I appeared, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Uncertainty, maybe, or awareness that something had shifted between us. But then his usual grin slipped into place, and he was asking if I wanted to grab breakfast before our 10 o'clock lectures. I said yes because I always said yes, and because some part of me was desperate to prove that everything was still normal between us. We walked to the dining hall the same way we always did, Felix talking animatedly about his morning run and how he'd nearly been taken out by a squirrel with apparently suicidal tendencies. I laughed at the right moments and made the appropriate responses, but I felt like I was performing a version of myself, watching from a distance as we acted out the familiar choreography of our friendship. Felix didn't mention the kiss. Not during breakfast, not during the walk to the humanities building, not during the brief moment we had between classes when we usually debriefed whatever had happened the night before. His silence felt deliberate, loaded with intention, and it made my stomach twist with anxiety. This wasn't like him. Felix was constitutionally incapable of leaving dramatic moments unexamined. He was the kind of person who would spend 20 minutes analyzing why someone had chosen to wear a particular shirt. But now he was acting like the most significant 3 seconds of my life had simply never occurred. The day crawled by with excruciating slowness. I sat through Professor Martinez's lecture on Victorian literature without absorbing a single word, too busy watching Felix out of the corner of my eye and trying to decode his unusually subdued behavior. During lunch, he was quieter than normal, picking at his food and responding to conversation with uncharacteristic brevity. Maya asked if he was feeling okay, and he brushed her off with a joke that felt forced. By evening, the silence had become unbearable. We were in the common room again, supposedly working on assignments, but really just existing in the same space the way we always did. Felix had his philosophy textbook open, but I noticed he'd been on the same page for 20 minutes. I was pretending to read Middlemarch while actually watching him, cataloging every small deviation from his normal behavior. Finally, when the tension felt like it might actually kill me, Felix looked up from his book and caught me staring. For a moment, neither of us looked away, and I felt that same electric current that had run through me the night before. Then he closed his textbook with deliberate care and leaned back against the couch. "Relax," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes watching my face carefully. "It was just a mess with them." The words hit me like a physical blow. Just a mess with them. A prank. A joke. Exactly what everyone in the room had assumed it was, and exactly what I'd been terrified he would say. I felt something inside me crumble, a hope I hadn't even realized I'd been nurturing suddenly extinguished. I laughed because that's what the script called for, but the sound that came out of me was wrong. Too sharp, too quick, too desperate to seem unaffected. Felix's expression shifted slightly, and I saw him studying my face with an intensity that made me want to hide. "Right," I managed to say. "Of course." Classic Felix. But even as I said it, even as I played my part in dismissing what had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in his eyes didn't match his words. There was a flicker of something that looked almost like disappointment when I laughed, a hesitation before he smiled that made me wonder if he was performing just as much as I was. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of forced normalcy. We watched a movie with some of the others, made plans for the weekend, argued good-naturedly about whether the campus coffee shop's new seasonal drink was worth the ridiculous price. All the usual rhythms of our friendship. But underneath it all, I felt the weight of unspoken questions. Later, when we were alone in the hallway outside our rooms, Felix lingered by his door like he wanted to say something else. I waited, heart hammering, hoping and dreading whatever words might come next. But he just ran a hand through his hair and said, "Good night," disappearing into his room with a soft click of his door. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the space where he'd been, trying to reconcile his words with the look in his eyes. Just to mess with them. The explanation should have been enough, should have allowed me to file the kiss away as another one of Felix's theatrical stunts and move on with my life. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd hesitated before saying it. The way his voice had sounded just slightly off, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. The way he'd watch my face when I laughed, like my reaction mattered more than it should have if the kiss had truly meant nothing. A seed of possibility took root in my chest, dangerous and fragile and impossible to ignore. What if it wasn't just a joke? What if Felix was lying too, protecting himself the same way I'd been protecting myself for 3 years? What if those 3 seconds had meant something to him as well, and his casual dismissal was just another performance, another way of keeping us both safe from the terrifying possibility that everything between us might be about to change? The thought kept me awake until dawn, hope and fear warring in my chest as I tried to decide whether I was seeing what I wanted to see or finally recognizing what had been there all along. The shift was subtle at first, so gradual I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But once that seed of possibility had taken root, I found myself hyper-aware of every interaction, analyzing each gesture and glance like I was decoding some elaborate cipher. It started with the way Felix touched me. He'd always been physical in the casual way some friends are, an arm slung around my shoulders during movie nights, a hand on my back when he leaned over to see what I was reading, fingers briefly tangling with mine when he handed me something. Normal contact that I'd trained myself not to think about too deeply. But now, in the weeks following the kiss, those touches felt different, more deliberate. His hand would linger a fraction of a second longer on my shoulder. When he passed me my coffee in the morning, his fingers would brush mine with what felt like intention. I told myself I was reading too much into it, projecting my own newly acknowledged feelings onto innocent gestures. But then I'd catch him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, something thoughtful and almost hungry that made my breath catch in my throat. When I looked directly at him, he'd glance away, but not quickly enough to hide the fact that he'd been staring. The worst part was how it made me second-guess everything I thought I knew about our friendship. Had he always looked at me like that, and I'd just been too carefully oblivious to notice? Had there been signs I'd missed, moments when his feelings had been as transparent as mine apparently were now? The uncertainty was maddening, especially because I couldn't ask without risking everything we'd built together. Our evening study sessions became exercises in exquisite torture. Felix had started lingering in my room more often, claiming his was too messy to concentrate in, though I suspected his mess tolerance had mysteriously decreased since the kiss. He'd sprawl across my bed with his textbooks while I sat at my desk, and I'd find myself acutely aware of his presence in ways that felt both familiar and completely new. One night, about 2 weeks after everything changed, he was lying on his stomach reading for his philosophy class, ankles crossed in the air behind him. I was supposed to be working on an essay about narrative structure in Wuthering Heights, but I kept getting distracted by the way the lamplight caught the highlights in his hair, the way he absently chewed on his pen when he was thinking, the soft sound he made when he encountered a particularly complex passage. I need to focus, I told myself sternly, forcing my attention back to my laptop screen. But then Felix shifted, rolling onto his side to face me, and the movement drew my gaze like a magnet. "You're staring again," he said quietly, but there was no teasing in his voice. Just a simple observation that made my cheeks flush with heat. "Sorry," I mumbled, turning back to my essay with what I hoped looked like casual embarrassment. "Just thinking about this paper." "What's it about?" "The unreliable narrator," I said, which felt absurdly appropriate given how unreliably I was interpreting every moment between us. How sometimes the person telling the story can't be trusted to tell you what's really happening. Felix was quiet for a long moment, and when I glanced over, he was watching me with that unreadable expression again. "Interesting topic," he said finally. "How do you know when someone's being unreliable?" The question felt loaded, like he was asking about more than my literature assignment. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. I guess you look for inconsistencies. Times when what they say doesn't match what they do, or when they claim something doesn't matter to them, but their actions suggest otherwise. Felix said, and I could hear the thoughtfulness in the sound. And what if they're lying to themselves, too? What if they don't even know they're being unreliable? I felt my pulse quicken. Then I think you have to pay attention to the subtext, I said carefully. Look for what they're not saying directly. The silence that followed felt charged with unspoken meaning. I could hear Felix breathing, could feel the weight of his gaze, even though I was determinedly staring at my laptop screen. The space between us seemed to hum with tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. Then he was moving, sliding off the bed and crossing the small space to where I sat. He didn't say anything, just leaned against my desk, so he was facing me, close enough that I could smell his soap and see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Emery," he said softly, and the way he said my name made something flutter in my chest. There was a question in it, or maybe a confession, and I found myself leaning slightly toward him without conscious thought. For a moment, I thought he was going to kiss me again. His eyes dropped to my mouth, and I felt that same electric anticipation I'd experienced in the common room. The rational part of my brain was screaming warnings about ruining our friendship, about misreading signals, about the danger of hoping for something that might not be real. But the rest of me was utterly still, waiting. He lifted his hand as if to touch my face, fingers hovering just inches from my cheek. I could feel the warmth of his skin, could see the slight tremor in his hand that suggested he was as nervous as I was. This was it, I thought. This was the moment when one of us would finally be brave enough to acknowledge what was happening between us. But then voices in the hallway broke the spell. Felix's hand dropped, and he stepped back quickly, running it through his hair in a gesture I recognized as nervous habit. The moment shattered like glass, leaving us both standing there in the aftermath of something that had almost happened. "Sorry," he said, though I wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. "I should let you work on your paper." He gathered his books with uncharacteristic haste and was gone before I could find my voice to respond, leaving me alone with the lingering scent of his cologne and the maddening certainty that I hadn't imagined what had just passed between us. I stared at my laptop screen for another hour, reading the same paragraph over and over without comprehension, my mind replaying every second of that almost moment. The way he'd looked at me, the way his hand had trembled, the way my name had sounded like a question on his lips. He was lying, I realized, just like I'd been lying, just like we'd both been lying for 3 years, maybe longer. The kiss hadn't been just a joke, and neither was the way he'd almost kissed me again tonight. We were both unreliable narrators of our own story, too afraid to tell the truth even to ourselves. But now I knew, and from the way he'd fled my room, I suspected he was beginning to know it too. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in late October, 3 weeks after the almost kiss in my room. I've been trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the constant tension was wearing on both of us. Felix had started avoiding being alone with me, which only made me more aware of how deliberately he was doing it. Study sessions moved back to the common room. Movie nights included other people. Even our usual coffee runs became group activities. I was exhausted from pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. The careful dance we'd been performing around each other had become unbearable, and I could see in Felix's increasingly strained smiles that he felt it too. Something had to give. I found him in the library that evening, tucked into one of the corner study carrels on the 3rd floor, where hardly anyone ever ventured. He had his philosophy textbook open, but he was staring out the window at the campus quad below, completely lost in thought. The sight of him sitting there alone, looking more troubled than I'd ever seen him, made something in my chest crack open. I approached quietly, but he must have heard my footsteps because he turned before I reached him. His face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, relief, something that might have been longing, then careful neutrality. "Hey," he said, closing his book with deliberate casualness. "Didn't expect to see you here. I couldn't do it anymore." Couldn't pretend that the careful distance he'd been maintaining wasn't killing me. Couldn't act like everything was normal when we both knew it wasn't. The words came out before I could stop them, raw and desperate. "You can't keep doing that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying all the frustration and confusion I'd been holding inside. "You can't just kiss me and then pretend it was nothing. You can't almost kiss me again and then run away like you're scared of me. You can't keep looking at me like—" I stopped, my voice catching in my throat. Felix was staring at me with wide eyes, and I could see him processing what I'd just said, the admission buried in my accusation. "Like what?" he asked softly, and there was something vulnerable in his voice that made my heart race. "Like I mean something to you," I finished, the words coming out barely audible. "Like I mean something to you, in ways I'm not supposed to understand." The silence that followed felt endless. I watched Felix's face, saw him struggling with something internal, some war between what he wanted to say and what he thought he should say. His hands were trembling slightly where they rested on the desk. "Emery," he started, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in that gesture I knew meant he was nervous. "What if you do?" My heart stopped. "What? What if you do mean something to me?" he said, his voice gaining strength even as his hands shook harder. "What if the kiss wasn't a joke at all? What if I've been lying this whole time, not just to you, but to myself?" I felt the world tilt beneath me. "You said it was just a mess with them." "I know what I said," Felix replied, and there was pain in his voice now. "I said it because I was terrified, because admitting the truth would change everything between us, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. But I can't keep pretending anymore either." He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving mine. "I kissed you because I wanted to. Because I've wanted to for so long, I can't even remember when it started. Because when I'm with you, I feel like the person I'm supposed to be, and when I'm not with you, I feel like I'm just waiting to get back to you." The confession hit me like a physical blow. All the careful analysis, all the wondering and hoping and second-guessing. And here was Felix laying his heart bare in a corner of the library at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. "How long?" I whispered, though part of me was afraid of the answer. Felix's smile was sad and self-deprecating. "Remember sophomore year, when you got food poisoning and I stayed with you all night? You were so sick you could barely keep your eyes open, but you kept apologizing for keeping me up. And I remember thinking that there was nowhere else I'd rather be, that taking care of you felt like the most natural thing in the world. That's when I knew it wasn't just friendship anymore." The memory washed over me. I'd been so miserable that night, but Felix had been there with cool washcloths and ginger ale and gentle jokes to distract me from how awful I felt. I thought it was just him being a good friend. "That was over a year ago," I said, my voice barely audible. "I know. I've been carrying this around for over a year, watching you, hoping maybe you felt something too, but too scared to risk finding out I was wrong." We stared at each other across the small space of the study corral, both of us breathing hard like we'd just confessed crimes. In a way, I suppose we had. The crime of loving your best friend, of wanting more than friendship allows, of lying to yourself and everyone around you about the true nature of your feelings. "What if I wasn't joking?" Felix asked quietly, his voice so soft I had to lean forward to hear him. "What if when I kissed you, it was because I wanted to know what it would feel like to stop pretending, just for 3 seconds, that we were only friends?" I looked at him, this person who had been my anchor for 3 years, who knew all my fears and dreams, and the way I liked my coffee, and what books made me cry. Felix, who had apparently been carrying the same secret I'd been carrying, just as carefully and just as painfully. "Then don't stop," I whispered, the words falling from my lips before I could second-guess them. His eyes widened. "What?" I took a shaky breath, gathering every ounce of courage I possessed. "If you weren't joking, if it meant something to you too, then don't stop. Don't pull away. Don't run. Just don't stop." For a moment, neither of us moved. The library around us was silent, except for the soft hum of heating vents and the distant sound of pages turning somewhere in the stacks. Then Felix was reaching across the small space between us, his hand cupping my face with a tenderness that made my breath catch. "Are you sure?" he asked, and I could hear 3 years of careful friendship in the question, all the history we'd be risking if we crossed this line. Instead of answering with words, I leaned into his touch, covering his hand with mine. The gesture was answer enough. And finally, he kissed me. Not quick and startling like that first time, not hesitant like the almost kiss in my room, but slow and deliberate and real. His lips were soft against mine, and I could taste the truth in the kiss. 3 years of hidden feelings finally given permission to exist. When we broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, both of us breathing hard in the quiet space between us. What if it wasn't a joke? He whispered against my lips. It never was. I whispered back and felt him smile before he kissed me again. This kiss was nothing like the first one, where that had been quick and startling and performed for an audience. This was slow and careful and entirely ours. Felix's lips were soft against mine, tentative at first, as if he was still afraid I might pull away. But when I leaned into him instead, when I let my hand find the back of his neck and tangle in his hair, he deepened the kiss with a quiet sound that sent warmth racing through my entire body. We broke apart after what felt like hours or maybe seconds, both of us breathing hard in the silence of the empty library. Felix's forehead rested against mine, his eyes still closed, and I could feel the rapid pulse of his heartbeat where our hands were still connected. "What happens now?" he whispered, and I could hear all the uncertainty in the question. 3 years of friendship, of careful boundaries, of a dynamic we'd perfected. All of it was different now, transformed by honesty and the taste of his mouth against mine. I didn't have an answer. The truth was, I had no idea what happened next. We were in uncharted territory, standing at the edge of something that felt both inevitable and impossibly fragile. One wrong move, one moment of doubt, and we could lose not just this new thing between us, but everything we'd built together. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely audible in the quiet space between us. But I know I don't want to pretend anymore. I don't want to go back to analyzing every touch and wondering what you're thinking and being afraid to want what I want. Felix opened his eyes then, and the look in them was so tender it made my chest ache. "What do you want?" The question hung in the air, simple and complex all at once. What did I want? I wanted to wake up next to him on Sunday mornings. I wanted to hold his hand while we walked across campus. I wanted to kiss him goodnight and good morning and any time in between when the impulse struck me. I wanted to stop being afraid of the way he made me feel and just feel it fully and without reservation. But I also wanted to keep what we'd always had. The easy comfort of our friendship, the way we could sit in silence together without it feeling empty, the shared jokes and inside references that made us a unit distinct from everyone else. I wanted to keep being the person he called when he couldn't sleep, the one who knew how he took his coffee and what movies made him cry, and exactly what to say when his father called with another round of disappointed expectations. "You," I said finally, the word carrying all the weight of 3 years of careful denial. "I want you. All of it. The friendship and whatever comes next, and everything we've been too scared to admit we wanted." A smile spread across Felix's face, slow and genuine and brighter than anything I'd seen from him in weeks. The relief in it was palpable, like he'd been holding his breath for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to exhale. We sat there for a long moment, just looking at each other, both of us trying to adjust to this new reality. The same faces, the same people we'd been an hour ago, but everything fundamentally altered. I kept expecting to feel panic, the overwhelming terror of having crossed a line we could never uncross. Instead, I felt something like peace settling in my chest. This was right. Whatever came next, this moment, this honesty between us, was exactly where we were supposed to be. "We should probably go back," Felix said eventually, though he made no move to gather his books. "It's getting late." I nodded, but neither of us stood up. The spell of this moment felt too precious to break, too fragile to trust to the outside world just yet. Here in the quiet corner of the library, with the soft glow of the reading lamps and the distant sound of the wind against the windows, we could exist in this new version of ourselves without having to explain it to anyone else. "Are we going to tell people?" I asked, the practical considerations starting to creep in around the edges of the happiness. Felix was quiet for a moment, considering. "Do we need to? I mean, right away." I understood what he meant. The thought of facing our friends tomorrow, of navigating their questions and assumptions and well-meaning curiosity felt overwhelming. This thing between us was too new, too tender to subject to external scrutiny just yet. Maybe we keep it to ourselves for a while, I suggested. Figure out what this is before we have to explain it to everyone else. Felix's smile was soft with understanding. I like that. Just us for now. We finally managed to pack up our books and leave the library, but everything felt different as we walked back across campus. The space between us hummed with awareness, with the knowledge of what had just changed. When Felix's hand brushed against mine as we walked, I didn't pull away. When he looked at me, I looked back without the careful guard I'd maintained for so long. At the entrance to our dorm, he stopped and turned to face me. The outdoor lights cast shadows across his features, making his eyes look darker, more serious. "Emery," he said, and my name sounded different in his voice now. Less careful, more intimate. "I want you to know that I don't regret this. Whatever happens, whatever this becomes, I don't regret finally being honest with you." I reached for his hand then, lacing our fingers together in the space between us. The gesture felt monumental and natural all at once. "Neither do I told him, and meant it completely." We stood there for another moment, reluctant to separate, to return to our individual rooms and the solitude that would give us space to process what had just happened. But eventually, Felix squeezed my hand once and let go, stepping back with a smile that held promises for tomorrow. "Good night," he said, and the word carried weight it had never held before. "Good night," I replied, watching as he disappeared down the hallway toward his room. I stood in the empty corridor for a long time after he was gone, my hands still warm from his touch, my lips still tingling from his kiss. 3 years of friendship had just transformed into something else entirely, something undefined and terrifying and beautiful. We had chosen each other finally and completely, and there was no going back. But for the first time in weeks, the thought of moving forward didn't scare me. Whatever came next, we would figure out together the way we'd figured out everything else. The only difference now was that we didn't have to pretend anymore that it was just friendship driving us toward each other. I touched my fingers to my lips, still tasting the sweetness of honesty, and smiled. The next morning arrived with an almost surreal normalcy. Sunlight filtered through my blinds the same way it had for 3 years. My alarm went off at the same time, and the sounds of the dormitory waking up were exactly as they'd always been. But when I opened my door and found Felix waiting in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and a smile that was somehow both familiar and entirely new, I knew that everything had shifted in ways that couldn't be undone. "Good morning," he said, offering me one of the cups, and the simple greeting carried an intimacy that made warmth spread through my chest. His fingers brushed mine as I took the coffee, a touch that would have been meaningless yesterday, but now felt intentional, significant. "Good morning," I replied, and found myself smiling back with an openness I hadn't allowed myself before. We walked to breakfast together the way we always had, but the quality of the silence between us was different. Less careful, more comfortable. When Maya asked if we wanted to join her and some others for a study session later, we exchanged a look that held entire conversations, the kind of wordless communication we'd perfected over years of friendship, but which now carried additional layers of meaning. Throughout the day, nothing dramatic happened. No grand gestures, no public declarations, no fundamental alteration of the rhythms we'd established over 3 years of being inseparable. To anyone watching, we were exactly the same as we'd always been. Felix still made terrible jokes during Professor Chen's lecture. I still rolled my eyes at them while fighting back laughter. He still stole food from my plate at lunch. I still pretended to be annoyed while sliding my sandwich closer to his reach. But underneath the familiar choreography of our friendship, everything was different. When Felix leaned over to read something on my laptop screen, I was acutely aware of his proximity, the scent of his shampoo, the way his shoulder pressed against mine. When I caught him watching me during dinner, instead of looking away with carefully maintained indifference, I held his gaze and let him see that I was watching him back. The real changes were in the spaces between the public moments. The way Felix's hand would find mine under the table during group conversations, fingers intertwining with a naturalness that took my breath away. The way he would brush his thumb across my knuckles when he thought no one was looking, a gesture so tender it made my heart race. The way I could lean into him now during movie nights, resting my head against his shoulder without the careful calculation I'd employed before, without wondering if I was crossing invisible lines. Our friends noticed nothing, or if they did, they attributed it to the same dynamic we'd always had. Maya commented that we seemed more relaxed lately, less weirdly tense than we'd been for the past few weeks. Derek joked that we were practically an old married couple anyway, finishing each other's sentences and communicating with looks across rooms. If only they knew how close to the truth that observation was becoming. The evening brought the kind of November chill that made everyone retreat indoors early. Our usual crowd had scattered to various rooms and obligations, leaving Felix and me alone in the common room with our textbooks and the comfortable quiet we'd always shared. I was working on a paper about narrative perspective, the irony of which wasn't lost on me, while Felix read for his philosophy class, occasionally muttering complaints about Descartes under his breath. At some point, without discussion or fanfare, he moved from a chair he'd been occupying to the couch where I was sitting, settling beside me with his book propped against my knee. It was the kind of casual intimacy we'd shared countless times before, but now I was hyper-aware of every point where our bodies touched, every breath he took, every small movement he made. When he finished his reading and closed his book, I felt his attention shift to me. I looked up from my laptop to find him watching me with that expression I was learning to recognize, soft and wondering and full of affection I no longer had to pretend not to see. "Come here," he said quietly, and I didn't hesitate to close my laptop and lean into him, letting him wrap his arms around me in a way that felt both natural and revolutionary. We sat like that for a long time, not talking, just existing in this new space we'd created for ourselves. His hand traced lazy patterns on my arm, and I could feel his breathing gradually synchronize with mine. This was what I'd been missing without knowing it, I realized. Not just the physical comfort, though that was wonderful, but the permission to be openly affectionate with the person I cared about most in the world. "I love you," Felix said suddenly, the words spoken so quietly against my hair that I almost wondered if I'd imagined them. But when I pulled back to look at his face, I saw the truth of it written in his expression, vulnerable and certain all at once. The words should have terrified me. Love was a magnitude beyond what we'd confessed in the library, a weight that could crush whatever fragile thing we were building between us. But instead of fear, I felt a deep sense of rightness, like a puzzle piece clicking into place after years of trying to force it into the wrong spot. "I love you too," I said, and watched relief and joy bloom across his features in equal measure. He kissed me then, soft and unhurried, and it tasted like coming home. When we broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, both of us smiling like we'd just discovered something precious that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Later, when we finally retreated to our separate rooms, I sat at my desk with my cold coffee and tried to process the enormity of what had just happened. 24 hours ago, I'd been drowning in unspoken feelings and desperate uncertainty. Now Felix's hand rested on my knee under the table of my memory, steady and sure and unshakable, a promise of all the hidden intimacies to come. Nothing had been announced. Nothing had been explained to the outside world. We were still the same two people we'd always been, still the best friends who'd found each other freshman year and never let go. But beneath the surface, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, everything had transformed. I thought about the essay I'd been writing, about unreliable narrators and the stories people tell themselves to avoid uncomfortable truths. For 3 years, I've been both the narrator and the reader of my own carefully edited story, one where Felix was just my best friend and the ache in my chest was just normal affection, and the way he looked at me meant nothing more than friendship. But some stories, I was learning, are only unreliable until you're brave enough to tell them honestly. And this story, our story, was finally ready to be told the way it had always been meant to be told. Not as a joke, not as something to be dismissed or explained away, but as the love story it had always been, patient and steady and unshakable, waiting for us to be ready to recognize it for what it was. I touched my fingers to my lips, still tasting the sweetness of finally being honest, and smiled into the darkness of my room. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new ways of navigating this transformed relationship. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, loved by the person who mattered most, no longer pretending that what we had was anything less than everything.